Hi, everybody. Welcome to Embodied Awakenings. This is your place for mental, emotional well being and freedom from the legacy of trauma. I'm your host, Toni, from thetraumadoula.com, and welcome. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about the stages and phases of trauma recovery. And this is something I'm really excited to talk about because I recognize in this space, there's not a lot of people talking about what it looks like to actually recover from trauma. And this is specifically for my adult survivors of childhood trauma. If you are currently experiencing traumatic events and things like this, you're in a different stage. You're not working through recovery. So, firstly, I always suggest reaching out to your local professionals and seeing if you can get support getting out of any situations if you're currently in a unsafe situation at this moment. Okay. Now, just to start to get into this episode a little bit, just before we get into this episode, I'd like to remind everybody that I have a new newsletter on thetraumadoula.com, and I'll leave the link in the description box below. But the newsletter is really cool. It's full of nice, neat things. It'll have just some content, some things that I've been writing, because sometimes things are best written, things are best said in pen and in ink. And I have lots of things that don't get put out, and now they're getting put into the newsletter. So to keep up on everything that I'm doing here and to hear from me and see what is coming through the grapevine, sign up for the newsletter in the description box. Now, let's get into the show. So, a lot of times, an event happens, and I'm working with, we'll start with the old definition of trauma. This is an old definition that I was working with 7 years ago. 7 years ago, I thought trauma is anything that surpasses your ability to cope. Right? It's a pretty good basic understanding of trauma and what that is. When you experience it in your body and it becomes an issue, is when you can't cope. And honestly, I started to rethink this all together. And that was because it actually didn't make sense. Oftentimes, as survivors, I'm also a survivor of childhood trauma, as survivors are highly resilient. We have an astounding and sometimes miraculous ability to cope with things that we should never, ever have had to deal with. And so it really began to change my mind space about that definition. And this is really important when we talk about recovery because we have to understand what we're recovering from. And ability to cope tends to put the whole role of dealing with a traumatic event onto the victim. But trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens through and with and surrounded by other human beings. And, sometimes there's natural disasters, but again, it's an environmental thing. And a lot of times, this is where I'll bring in my new working definition of trauma. So, my new working definition, and this is important when you are thinking about the events, the things that happened at the point that had been the most traumatic for you. So think about the circumstances around it, not the actual event, because oftentimes People say it's not the actual event that was traumatizing, it's the things that happened around that event. It's the people, places, and things, the environment. So the new definition of trauma that I am working with at this point in time as someone in the trauma recovery space is an inability to respond or be supported in a way that is physiologically necessary to bring about safety and a sense of control over safety. What does that mean? Because oftentimes I realize, I have that part social work brain. So it comes up with these these definitions that are very, what do you call it? Academic, right? But that's not helpful when you're thinking about it in academic terms. So let's break it down. An inability to be supported literally means that the people around you didn't give you the support to feel safe, seen, and loved. Oftentimes, bad things happen, but when you have support, you can get through those bad things, even terrible things. And we're so divided in community right now, but let me get on track. An inability to feel supported so that physiologically in your body, this is where we bring the body in your body, you were not allowed to feel safe. After the thing happens, after you tell your parental, your caregiver, after you tell your best friend or your spouse, after all these things fall into place and these people around you who are supposed to be your people either cannot or do not support you, their responses are repulsion or it was your fault, victim blaming, right? And you need safe people in your life so that you can feel safe enough to heal and physiologically. So, necessary to bring about safety and a sense of control over your own safety. So, when you have a sense of loss of control, oftentimes that brings about the actual trauma, right? Is that sense of loss of control over your own safety. So, not only are you not supported, but now you don't feel like you're in control of being safe in the world. And for all of my BIPOC people, my Black, Indigenous, and people of color, you know, we, I'm going to speak for, Black folks in the United States at this moment. We don't get to control our sense of safety. And so, yes, living in a brown body, in a Black body, is oftentimes a trauma in and of itself. So when we're talking about that sense of control of safety, that is its own trauma. So it's kind of a two-part definition. So I'm going to read it to you again after I've explained it to you. An inability to respond or be supported in a way that is physiologically necessary to bring about safety and a sense of control over safety. Now, moving in, take a moment in this moment. Take a nice deep breath in, nice and slow, and let it out, nice and slow. Soften your forehead, soften your jaw, let your shoulders drop. Sometimes talking even about recovery and what trauma is can be triggering. So at any moment, take a moment to pause, to take a deep breath, and to notice your body. Now, moving on. Coming into what it means to be in that first stage of trauma recovery. You're just getting started on this journey. And I call this stage the victim stage. Things happened, you're now a victim of some kind. And the first step in this entire process is to find safety. And again, finding safety is going to be different for every single person that is hearing this podcast today, because every single one of you is in a different place. Every single one of you is in a different body. If you were in a fat body, what does finding safety look like? If you are disabled physically, what does finding safety look like? And I recognize that finding safety means so many different things. I'm going to share with you ways to seek safety that are, I hope, not dependent on those things as much as possible. And if you have ideas of your own that I don't mention, please go ahead, send me an email, leave me a little message, let me know, give me some more ideas. What do you do? But the way that we start to find safety is through our bodies. That's a lot of the way that I have learned to find safety, even being in a Black body, because embodiment, that is being present in my body with what is in this moment. Embodiment is really powerful. And that presence you get from embodiment is really powerful. There's really nothing like it. And so for me, um, I found embodiment as a way towards what has been, you know, labeled as finding your glimmers. And your glimmers are this way that you notice that there's a little tiny, the smallest amount of glitter in something. It can be the way that you make coffee in the morning and sitting and just drinking your coffee and doing nothing else, no TV, no phone, nothing, just sitting and drinking that coffee or tea or whatever it is, that smoothie. It could be going and sitting by a river. It can be taking that moment and taking a deep breath in and letting it out. These moments start to stabilize and recenter your nervous system. And you can begin to find safety. Now, phase two. Phase two is, I would say, as far as like moving forward, phase two is one of my favorite because there's a lot of emotion in phase two. And phase two is where, of trauma recovery, is where you really start to get into it, right? After you've done phase one, you found safety, you found, some of that calming in the body and the nervous system. What's going to start to happen as you move into phase two, and these aren't clean cut, they kind of move back and forth. They're fluid, okay? Just like gender, it's fluid, it's cool. It moves around as you slowly, fluidly move into the second phase. you start to remember things, maybe things that you never remembered before, maybe things that you feel sad about. You'll have all these emotions come up. Sometimes it's anger, resentment, grief. All these ranges of emotions begin to come up. Phase two is a wonderful phase to start keeping a journal if you can. I don't care if you write it, I don't care if you record it and talk. Keeping a journal and detailing, writing out what happened, not just what happened and what you thought about it, but those feelings that are coming up in the moment. Phase two is a great opportunity for that. You start to kind of review the past and go over what happened. You start to remember, relive all these feelings in your body that kind of seem like they're all over the place. And you start to deal with a lot of the grief. And something that I've recognized as a survivor is honestly, it's usually the grief of being of not getting what you really deserved, especially as a child. Like as a child, you deserve to be safe, you deserve to be loved, you deserve to be seen, you deserve to be held, and you deserve to walk into the room and see people's eyes light up because you're there, and you deserve to play. As a child, you deserve every single thing in the world that somebody could possibly give you, even if it's love and affection and joy, right? Doesn't have to be money. Sometimes we forget that the things that we really needed were the emotional intelligence, the emotional support, that connection, right? And so a lot of times there's a lot of grief around what you should have had, right? How you should have been treated. And there can be a lot of anger around how people didn't allow you to be you, right? Because that anger is all about the boundaries. It's all about having your boundaries crossed. And, a lot of times, especially I'll say female bodied people, have a hard time even um, working with their anger because they were always taught that they weren't supposed to be angry. So have some other feelings, sure, but the anger, no, that's not one you're allowed to have, because you're not supposed to have boundaries as a female body person. You are just supposed to, exist and serve this other half of the population. If you're thinking about patriarchy and stuff. So in phase two, my biggest tip, trick, journal, write those feelings out, and learn about your feelings, channel your feelings. Your feelings are powerful entities that can support you on your journey. They know things that you could not put into words, right? They'll help you. Phase two is the survivor stage. So as phase one, you're a victim. Phase two, you start to be like, oh shit, I'm a survivor. I survived some stuff. Like, oh, I'm remembering these things, and maybe that was not great. As things start to shift a little bit more, you begin to move into this third phase of trauma recovery. And I call that phase in the archetypal the thriver, right? And the thriver integrates, right? So phase two is all about processing. Phase three is all about integrating. It's all about telling that new story. It's all about becoming bigger. It's not about coping better, because you don't need to cope with a bad situation. You're simply remembering, grieving, allowing yourself to feel the things in phase two. And in phase three, recognizing who the fuck you are and who the fuck you want to be now. You're telling this new story. You're integrating these things that happen. You're allowing these things to move in and out and through your body. And you are becoming, you are living life rather than letting life just live you. You are allowing and pushing through and moving forward in a stronger and more powerful way. Integration, for my spiritual folks, I'll speak to you about what integration feels like. Integration feels like a true spiritual awakening. It's the moment when you, not the moment you recognize that everything you've been told is probably a lie, but the moment that you know what you know. You don't believe anymore. You know you're a thriver. You know that you are inherently worthy and deserving of everything that you felt. In those moments of like being a victim and feeling isolated and alone and scared, moving through that survivor stage where you're just remembering feeling isolated, alone, and scared, and then telling this new story about yourself, like about where you are, about how you've moved through, about how you just feel like you can look around and see the world for the first time. It really is an awakening. And a part of the reason why I named this podcast Embodied Awakenings is because at a point in time, you you wake up again. You can see the world for what it is, the beautiful, the ugly, the scary, the sad, the depraved. You can see it all, and you can feel awe again. So the thrive part is about becoming alive again. And a lot of times people have lived so shut down, so in victim mentality. And I see it all the time. And I'm getting really emotional because that's the thing that I don't want people to ever feel or have to experience for the rest of their lives. I had somebody ask me, I've never felt alive. How do I know I can? How do I, where do I go? How does this work? How does this trauma recovery thing work? Because I've never felt it before. So how could I, there's nothing for me to get back to. And I am here to tell you, if you're in that place, if you are in that victim place, there is somewhere for you to go. There is a deeper story. There is a new place for you to live from. There is a new life for you to be had. There is a new story for there to be told. I am here to tell you because I experienced it and I lived it. And I really hope that if you get nothing else from this, I don't care if you ever work with me or not. If you get nothing else from this, I hope that you get the faith and the trust and the spark to keep going, because there is an embodied awakening for you. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast, and I will see you next week. Bye.